Hello everybody and welcome to this, my first of two videos on the Nikon F3, one of the most venerable cameras ever made, one of the longest produced cameras ever made, one of the most sought after Nikons ever made, and also my favorite Nikon. So for those of you, I don't have a pre-production copy of it available yet, but for those of you who learn really well by reading, or by reading and watching and listening at the same time, I have a print book and a Kindle book available. There are links in the video description to those that you can pick up to follow along with the content in this video about this specific camera. With photos taken of this camera, you're going to get to see it more than you could probably ever have wanted to. Anyway, as you can see, it is a very well used and well loved Nikon F3. The Nikon F3 is an interchangeable lens 35mm SLR. What does that mean? Interchangeable lens means that the lenses can be taken off of the camera and a different one can be put on at any time when you're not taking a photo without damaging the images or the camera. I definitely would not try changing lenses during a photo. 35mm means it can take any 35mm film, and SLR means it has a single lens that the light travels through to a mirror inside of it, and then this reflex pentaprism up here and to the viewfinder and your eye. And so what you see in the viewfinder is exactly what's going to be on the film, roughly, until the moment that the image is taken. This uses an 80-20 center-weighted 12% meter. Okay, what's that mean? If you imagine that what you're seeing right now is what's in your viewfinder, then the central 12% of the frame, which is, let's call it about that big, is going to be 80% of the metering information is in the middle, and the balance of the frame is going to account for 20% of the metering information. Center weighted is a really good general walk-around metering mode. However, 80-20 is a very strong split. Most meters are 60-40 to 75-25. 80-20 is flirting with center spot metering territory. Shutter speeds range from 8 seconds to 1/2000th, as well as time, bulb, and flash sync X, and automatic, of course. The viewfinder has a on the standard HP viewfinder, which this has, by the way. This will vary by viewfinder. This is the only one I have, so it's the only one I have information for. This is a 0.8x magnification with 100% viewfinder frame coverage. What does that mean? So the viewfinder is going to reduce what's coming through the lens to 80% of the size of what will be on your film, which is a bit small but okay for manual focus. And then frame coverage is 100%. So if we imagine that what you're seeing right now is what's going to be on your film, this is also what will be in your viewfinder. This does have interchangeable focusing screens, and there were 15 options available. In the second video, yes, we will see how to change those. The flash sync, which is the X speed on the dial, is 1/80th of a second. And as a fun fact about this camera, it was used by NASA. The target market for the Nikon F3 was the professional photographer. It was bought by lots of people. It was produced for 20-something years, 20-ish years. We'll get to that in a sec. And a lot of people bought it because this is a remarkably good camera, even though most people weren't professional and never bought tons and tons of system accessories. And it was popular by photographers across photographic skills. It was produced by Nikon in Japan from 1980 until 2001, so a 21-year production run. That is like the Pentax K1000 is the other serious SLR I know of that had a 21-year production run. So this is in very limited company. It was followed by the Nikon F2. I'm sorry, it was followed by the Nikon F4, and it was preceded by the Nikon F2. Now, as we do, let's go over all of the features on the camera, and we'll talk about what everything is. In the second video, we'll talk about what everything does. Starting technically on the front, these are the strap lugs, which is where you would connect a camera strap to carry it with. This silver thing here with the 3 contacts, this is a flash hot shoe adapter, and I don't have one, but you would put the adapter over this and then you could mount a flash onto it so that you could use a flash when your prism doesn't have a flash port. Film rewind right here, film back release right here, so you have to push this to the side and then you can lift your film rewind knob to open the back of the camera. Thank goodness, no film in there. This is your film ISO dial right here, where you can set your film speed. This is your exposure compensation gauge, and then there's a little index next to the 0, and you have your exposure compensation lock right here. So if you push this down, you can adjust your exposure compensation to intentionally give you an added stop of light, up to 2 added stops of light in 3rd stop increments, or up down to -2 stops of light, again in 3rd stop increments. And the exposure compensation will lock at whatever setting you have it set to. So this is going to be very useful when we see it in the second video for things like double exposures. Here's your prism. On the sides of your prism, depending on the exact prism you have, there are a couple of lock releases here we'll see in the second video. There's a little index right here on the side of the prism that tells you what shutter speed you're going to be set to. This is your shutter speed dial. So you can set it to A, and then that will lock in place. And then in the center, this little silver button is a release that will allow you to unlock it and move it. X also locks into place, but T and bulb do not, as do none of the other shutter speeds. So A and X, which are automatic and flash sync, are your 2 locking shutter speeds. This little symbol on the back of the camera indicates your film plane, so if you're doing microscopy or something that requires exact calculations from your film plane, that's that right there. This lever right here, which might be a little bit hard to see, but if I move it and now you can see the red dot, this is your self-timer lever. So on the front, if you activate the red dot and or the lever so you can see the red dot, that will turn on the self-timer, which will count down using this light on the flash of on the front of the camera rather, and give you a 10-second countdown. Mirror does not lock up with the self-timer, but we'll get to that being just fine in a moment. This is your on-off switch. Red means on, covered means off. Basically, it's more of a shutter lock than anything else. Not so much an on-off switch. Double exposure lever, we're going to see how to use that in the second video. Frame count window, this will tell you how many photos you've taken. On the front of the camera, we have your self-timer light right here. You have a grip here that you can hold, and the red line which was introduced with the F3. This is the mirror lockup lever depth of field preview button combo. So I'm going to set the lens here to f8, and let's push this silver button in, and you should be able to see that the aperture just stopped down. When you push the button in, that's your depth of field preview. When you want to lock up the mirror, you push this button down and then slide this lever out towards the F3. And I'll show you what that does with the lens off. Push the silver button, crane that out, and now we've locked up the mirror. So mirror lockup works very well with your self-timer. So you can lock up the mirror and use your self-timer, and that eliminates a lot of the shutter shake that you can get when the mirror activates. So that's a really good combination to use when you're doing things like micro and macro work, or even star trails and long exposure waterfalls. Down here is the backup release lever and the exposure memory button. So if we push this button down here on the top of it, that's the exposure memory button. We'll talk about that in the second video. And if we needed a backup shutter release, we could pry this away from the body. Ah, there we go. And it triggers the shutter. Just like that. So the backup shutter release button is a way to trigger the shutter if you don't have batteries in the camera. I believe that works without batteries. Let's find out. I want to question whether or not I'm right about that just right now. So we'll take the batteries out. Yes, so that will allow you to use the shutter without batteries. It's also recommended to use the backup shutter release with the time setting, because triggering time with the backup shutter release will not drain your batteries like it will if you use the shutter release, apparently. So we'll set the camera here to T, and that's how you use time with the backup shutter release. When you're done, then you just turn this to any other shutter speed and your time exposure ends. Lens mount ring, meter coupling index right here. So your AI lenses, which have a little notch right here, connect to this to communicate your aperture to your camera so that it knows how to meter. Lens mounting index for that white dot. This little button right next to it right here, if you push that down, you can then flip this metering pin out of the way, and you can now mount pre-AI or NAI lenses where the entire back of them is smooth and they don't have that notch. If you try to mount an NAI or pre-AI lens with this flipped in place like that, you can break it, and that's not a good situation. Lens release button. This is a flash coupling pin right here. Flash sync terminal, to be specific to the terminology that's used. The back of the camera doesn't have a whole lot to see. We have the viewfinder window here, and this is going to depend on your specific viewfinder, whether it's here or whether you have a waist level or whatever. Nikon, serial number, memo holder. So when you load your 35mm film, all you have to do is tear the top of the box off and slide it into this holder, and now you know what kind of film, how many exposures, and your ISO. And so, useful thing there. On the camera's bottom, we have this motor drive guide hole right here, which the motor drive, I don't have one to show you, but if you connected it, this would help make sure it aligned properly. The film rewind button right here, which we'll see in video 2 when it comes time to rewind the film. This is the motor drive's mechanical coupling linkage, so the motor drive would connect to this to provide a mechanical coupling to the camera. Tripod socket right here, so that you can connect a tripod or quick release plate to your camera. Battery chamber, we'll see this in the second video on how to change batteries. And then this is the motor drive electrical contacts and cover. And if you have the motor drive, we'll take the cover off right here really quickly. And there you go. You can see there's the brass or copper contacts are your electronic contacts, and then there's a geared mechanism in there. Actually, I think that's just the side the film goes into, isn't it? Yeah, it is. So that provides access for the rewind function of the motor drive to connect directly to your film as well. So if you don't have this cover, you're going to have problems with your film because you'll have a light leak going straight into your camera. So you'll want to try to get one of these, or if you got some, say, tinfoil, and put a tinfoil cover over here and then used electrical tape to tape it onto your camera, that would be a stopgap until you got your hands on a replacement cover. So we're going to tighten this back on. That should thread on very easily, by the way. If it feels like it's resisting, back it out and try again. You don't want to cross thread that cover. To get inside of the camera, we're going to push this lock release right here to the side, and then we can lift up the film back release. We'll lift it and the door will pop open, and now we're inside the camera and can see what all is in here. This is the film cassette chamber, and this is where we're going to put film in the second video when we load it. This is a film guide roller right here, which helps the film come out of the cassette smoothly. These guide rails here help keep the film traveling through the camera as they should. Basically, the two on the top and bottom prevent the film from moving up and down, and these two on the inside allow the film to be sandwiched flat onto the focusing plane for proper lens focusing. And they do that up against the film pressure plate, which we'll see in a second. Shutter, electronic contacts for the data back, which could be put on here. Film take-up or film tension sprocket right here. The film sprocket holes would connect to those sprocket teeth so that it could be pulled easily and smoothly through the camera. And the film take-up spool. This will wind the film onto it as the film's taken through the camera so that you can get to new film to take more photos. On the actual door of the camera, here we have a release pin, and if we push this down, now we can take the camera's door off. This allows us to remove this to put a data back onto the camera. This roller right here, as we'll see when I hold the film back in orientation as it would be when it's closed, aligns with this little space right here. And what this does is ensure that there's pressure on the film here so that the sprockets engage the sprocket holes. The film pressure plate lines up right here to keep the film flat as it moves through the camera. And then this little spring here helps keep the cassette properly aligned within the camera so that the film exits it and rewinds onto it easily. To replace the door of the camera, we simply put it on the pin on the bottom, lower the pin on the top with the switch, and then click it back into place. Now, this being not only my favorite Nikon, it is one of my 5 favorite cameras. It is perennially in my top favorite cameras list, and I don't see it ever losing that title as being one of my top 5. I'm going to have some tips on how to use this because I've used it a good deal. My first tip is that these are well made and they are rugged. Some of them now are very old, having been made in 1980. That's 43 years old as of this video's release. So obtaining repairs for these is getting harder. The whole point of that is enjoy your F3, don't abuse it. This is also, fun fact, the most heavily varied Nikon F model. There are 6 variants in total. The F3, the HP, which is this model, and we know it's the HP because it has this HP prism on it. That's the only difference between the F3 and the HP. There's the F3 Titanium, the F3 Press, the F3H, which I forget what that stands for off the top of my head, and the F3 Autofocus. And really the variants between those, some of them, the Titanium and the Press, I believe, had differences to the camera body, but I think the other ones were just became different models or variants based on accessories that were put onto them. The model of this that came out in 1983 was the stock F3, which included the DE2 viewfinder. So the stock F3 was the 1980 model with the DE2 viewfinder. The HP came out in 1982 and uses the high eye point variant with the DE3 viewfinder, and that's good for glasses wearers since most of the image frame could be seen by 2.5 centimeters, which is an inch, behind the viewfinder, like this. The DE3 prism does not allow 100% viewfinder frame coverage as the DE2 did, by the way. The F3T, which also came out in 82, was the same as the HP, only it was made of titanium, making it more durable and lighter. The F3P came out in 1983, and that was the Press or Photojournalist edition, and it included weather sealing, a different film back, and a different focusing screen, and a titanium prism housing. The F3 Limited was a scaled down version of the F3P, available only in Japan in 1984. So the Limited, which I didn't mention earlier, is a variant of the P. And also the P and the Limited used different electrical contacts for the viewfinder, which restricted the viewfinder accessories. The F3H, which came out sometime around 1998, I couldn't find an exact date for that, was the high speed, and it had a fixed pellicle mirror, could shoot 13 frames per second with a special NiCad battery, and 7.5 frames per second with AA alkaline batteries. Nikon stated that they only made 100 of those, but there may actually have been more than those. So the camera remains the fastest frame rate camera, including DSLRs, that Nikon made until 2014. So 13 frames per second is quite zippy. That's less than 3 seconds for a 36 frame roll of film. That's the kind of camera you'd want to use with the 250 frame back that could be put onto this. And the last one, the F3 autofocus, was released in '83 and included an autofocus viewfinder prism that worked with 2 early autofocus lenses. The Nikon F3 engineering and design began in 1971. From initial concept until the first of these arrived in the stores, took 9 years. That's quite the commitment to any camera. There are very few cameras that have had that much work put into them. This was also the first camera that Nikon had styled by Giorgetto Giugiaro, and many of his camera designs were gorgeous, by the way. I do think this is an incredibly pretty camera. This design for this camera was developed by him in 1977. It was the longest running production for any Nikon professional grade camera. I believe it was also the longest production run for any Nikon camera, and I think that still holds true today. The F6 might have run for longer. I don't have the dates of production for the F6 off the top of my head. Anyway, it is true, for those of you who are Indiana Jones fans, that a modified Nikon F3 was used in the Temple of Doom for the minecar point of view scenes. However, it was heavily modified because motion cameras are significantly different than still cameras. So I remember reading about the mods once. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but it functionally was not actually an F3 at that point. This was also the first Nikon camera with an electronically controlled shutter for highly accurate shutter timing. And also all of the parts for this camera were that they used in this were required to be sourceable for 20 years after the end of production, which meant until 2021. That said, I remember finding out in around 2012 that Nikon had stopped servicing F3 bodies, so while the parts were sourceable, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were repairable, at least not by Nikon. So as of now, which is now 2023 that I'm recording this, it's going to be increasingly hard to source parts for this. This was also the last manual focus professional tier film SLR body from Nikon. After this, the F4 converted to autofocus as its primary intention for focusing. And one last thing about this, if you've ever seen the Kodak DCS-100 digital camera, that was based on the Nikon F3 body. Now, next thing we're going to talk about is how to age your Nikon F3, because it is possible to figure out approximately, or pretty darn close to, when your camera was made. So we're going to come over here to the back of the camera, like this. We're going to remove the film back door. Now we're going to look under the hinge. And it's going to be really hard to see on this video. Let's see if I can do it. It's at least in focus, if not readable. There's going to be a code underneath that hinge. Now, the first character will be 1 through 9. That stands for January through September. O, N, or D stand for October, November, and December, respectively. The second character is the last digit of the production year. And then you can use the serial number to ascertain the decade of production, roughly. Higher serial number, later decade. So my code here is 09VJ. So we know it's October, and we know that the production year ended in 9. Well, this would mean it was either 89 or 99. We can look at the serial number. It starts with a 1. That's, as far as I understand it, relatively low, which tells us that this was likely produced in October of 1989. What the V and J mean, I don't know. Probably production run information, like which line, what time, which week of the month or day, something. I couldn't find out what those two characters mean. There are some things that you don't want to do with your Nikon F3. Don't store your camera with the shutter ready to fire. Always trigger the shutter at the end of the day before you store it, because even though it has an electromechanical shutter control, it does still have mechanical components. And when you advance the shutter winding lever, it's going to put tension on those springs and components, and if they sit like that over time, they can develop a memory and your timing can be thrown off, or worse, your shutter could fail. Don't touch the shutter curtains themselves, because that's a really good way to brick your camera. Don't touch the mirror that's behind the lens because your finger oils can desilver that mirror, which can cause it to tarnish, and that can affect your ability to focus, and it can affect your metering as well. Don't store your camera in your car in the heat. Then lubricating oils can get onto your lens, and if you saw when I did the depth of field preview, the person I bought this lens from told me it had clean aperture blades. That appears to have been a lie, but lubricating oil can get onto your aperture blades, which can cause them not to have proper timing, and that can throw off your exposure when you take a photo. Likewise, lubricating oils in the camera can get really thin and get to places they're not supposed to be. And then when they get back to their normal temperature, they are now going to muck with your system. Also, extreme cold is a really good way to cause lubricating oils in your camera and lens to become thick and gummy and break down, and that can ruin your camera's ability to work properly as well. And just as a general rule, a camera is something that is always going to be interesting for a thief to steal. Leaving your camera in your car is a good way to come back to not having a camera and having a broken window. So don't let your camera get wet. Even if you have the weather sealed version of it, those weather seals are going to be old, and so water getting into your electronics can short and ruin them. Same thing with dust. If dust gets in here, it can cause your lubricating oils to get thick and gummy, or it can cause excessive wear on the mechanical components in your camera. And just remember that your Nikon F3 is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for video 1. In video 2, we're going to go over everything on this camera and talk about how to use it.